Today we are diving into a complete, extremely detailed 2-hour cinematic beat editing masterclass that will take you from absolute beginner level to a professional understanding of how high-end cinematic edits are built inside After Effects and Premiere Pro. This is not a shortcuts video, and it is not a basic overview. This is a full production breakdown of how professional editors construct high-energy, music-synced, cinematic beat edits that you see in trailers, gaming montages, music videos, and viral short-form content across platforms. By the end of this session, you will not just know which buttons to press, you will understand the logic behind motion, timing, rhythm, and emotional control, and you will be able to build your own edits with intention instead of guessing. We are going to start inside After Effects, and for the next 90 minutes, we are going to build everything from the ground up. Before anything else, you need to understand that cinematic editing is not about effects, it is about timing systems layered on top of motion systems. Every professional-looking edit you have ever seen is built on three core foundations: rhythm, motion control, and energy shaping. Without these three elements, even the most complex effects will look flat and unprofessional. The first thing we need to talk about is project setup. This is something most beginners ignore completely, but in professional environments, this is one of the most important steps. When you open After Effects, you always start by creating a new project and saving it immediately into a dedicated folder. The reason for this is simple. Cinematic edits usually involve multiple assets, audio tracks, precomps, and sometimes hundreds of keyframes. If your project is not structured properly from the beginning, you will run into missing files, broken links, lag, and timeline confusion later in the process. Organization is not optional at a professional level, it is part of the workflow. Once your project is saved, you create a new composition. For most cinematic content, 1920 by 1080 is the standard resolution because it provides a perfect balance between quality and performance. Higher resolutions are not necessary unless you are working in film production or high-end commercial delivery. Now, frame rate is where things become extremely important. If you want a cinematic, film-like motion style, you use 24 frames per second. This creates natural motion blur and a more organic visual flow. If you want sharper, more aggressive motion like gaming edits or social media beat edits, you use 30 frames per second. The key rule here is consistency. Once you choose a frame rate, you never change it mid-project because it will completely destroy keyframe timing and motion consistency. Now we move into one of the most important steps in the entire workflow, which is audio preparation. Import your music into the timeline and listen to it carefully from start to finish. Do not rush this step. Professional editors do not just hear music, they analyze it. Every strong beat, every kick, every snare, every bass drop becomes a structural anchor point for motion. Every time you hear a strong hit, you place a marker. These markers are not random. They are your motion blueprint. Every zoom, every shake, every transition, every cut will be aligned to these markers. If your markers are off by even one frame, the entire edit will feel slightly wrong, even if viewers cannot explain why. Now let's move into keyframes, which are the foundation of everything in After Effects animation. A keyframe is simply a stored value at a specific point in time. When you create two keyframes with different values, After Effects automatically creates motion between them. But what most beginners do not understand is that keyframes are not just animation tools, they are timing controllers. The way you space keyframes determines the emotional speed of your motion. The most important animation in cinematic beat editing is the scale punch. This is the fast zoom that happens exactly on a beat. To create this, you first select your footage and open the scale property. You place a keyframe one frame before the beat at 100% scale. Then you move exactly onto the beat and increase the scale to around 105 to 115% depending on footage quality. Then one frame after the beat, you return back to 100%. This creates a sharp impact zoom. But at this stage, the animation still feels robotic because default interpolation is linear. So you apply easy ease, which smooths acceleration and deceleration. However, easy ease alone is not enough. To make your animation truly cinematic, you must use the graph editor. The graph editor is where professional motion control begins. Instead of thinking in values, you think in velocity curves. A steep curve means fast motion, a flat curve means slow motion. For a cinematic scale punch, you want a very steep curve entering the beat, meaning motion accelerates rapidly into impact, and a soft curve exiting the beat, meaning motion relaxes naturally afterward. This simulates real physical inertia, like a camera being physically pushed and then settling. Now we add position animation on top of scale. This is where the camera punch effect comes in. You slightly offset the position down and right by a few pixels on the beat frame. This creates the illusion of physical impact. When scale and position are combined, the motion feels grounded instead of floating. If needed, you can also add slight rotation, but rotation must always be controlled carefully. Too much rotation breaks visual stability and makes the footage uncomfortable to watch. Next we move into time remapping, which is one of the most powerful tools in After Effects. Time remapping allows you to control speed inside a single clip. You can slow down, speed up, freeze frames, or create speed ramps. The professional structure of time remapping is based on tension building. You slow down slightly before a beat to create anticipation, then you hit the beat with either a freeze frame or a sudden speed increase, then you return to normal speed. This contrast between motion states is what creates cinematic energy. But when you slow footage down, you will often encounter stuttering or choppy motion. This is because After Effects is repeating frames instead of generating new ones. To solve this, we use frame blending and pixel motion interpolation. Pixel motion analyzes movement between frames and generates new intermediate frames, which creates smooth slow motion that looks like it was shot on a high-end camera. This is one of the biggest differences between amateur and professional slow motion work. Now we move into motion blur. Real cameras naturally create motion blur due to shutter exposure, but After Effects does not simulate this by default. So we enable motion blur manually for layers and compositions. The standard cinematic setting is a 180-degree shutter angle, which creates a natural blur amount that mimics real-world camera behavior. Motion blur is essential because without it, animations feel sharp, digital, and artificial. Next, we talk about anchor points. This is one of the most underestimated parts of animation. If your anchor point is not centered properly, your scale and rotation will feel off. The object will not zoom correctly into its center, and instead will feel like it is drifting. Professional editors always ensure anchor points are perfectly aligned before animation begins. Now we introduce expressions, which are used to automate motion. The most common one is wiggle, which creates natural camera shake. Instead of manually keyframing shake, you apply wiggle with frequency and amplitude values. This creates organic movement that reacts dynamically to intensity. You can even link wiggle intensity to audio levels, which allows motion to automatically respond to music. At this stage, we also add audio-driven animation using audio keyframes. This converts music volume into usable data inside After Effects. You can link this data to scale, opacity, or brightness, creating automatic beat-reactive animation systems. This is how professional motion graphics often achieve perfect synchronization without manually keyframing every beat. Subtle color adjustments are then added to reinforce impact. A quick brightness flash on beat moments or slight contrast spikes can significantly enhance perceived intensity. However, restraint is critical. Overuse of color effects destroys cinematic consistency. Now we transition into Premiere Pro, where we focus on the final 30 minutes of advanced cutting techniques. Even if your After Effects work is perfect, weak editing structure in Premiere Pro will break the entire video. Editing is not just motion, it is also rhythm control through cuts. The first concept is precision trimming. Professional editors do not place clips loosely on a timeline. Every cut is intentional and frame accurate. Tools like Ripple Edit and Roll Edit are essential because they allow you to adjust timing without breaking overall sequence flow. Every frame matters in cinematic editing. Next we talk about J-cuts and L-cuts. A J-cut is when audio enters before video, and an L-cut is when audio continues after video changes. These techniques create smooth transitions and prevent abrupt cuts. They are used in all professional film editing because they make transitions feel natural instead of mechanical. Match cutting is another advanced technique where two shots are connected through motion, shape, or direction. This creates visual continuity across different scenes and makes the edit feel intentional rather than random. Cutting on action is also essential. Instead of cutting during still moments, you cut during movement. This creates continuity of motion and keeps energy flowing through the sequence. Combined with beat syncing, this creates powerful rhythmic structure. Jump cuts are also used strategically, but only when they enhance intensity. When used correctly, jump cuts create urgency and chaos, especially in music-driven edits. Finally, pacing control is what defines professional editing. Pacing is not just speed, it is emotional rhythm. You always structure edits in waves, slow build, fast peak, and controlled release. Without pacing structure, even visually impressive edits feel empty. The final workflow is a hybrid system. You build structure in Premiere Pro, enhance motion in After Effects, then return to Premiere Pro for final polish, color grading, and audio balancing. This workflow is used across professional studios because it separates responsibilities clearly between structure, motion, and finishing. At this point, editing is no longer about tools. It becomes about control over time, emotion, and attention. Every frame is intentional, every cut has meaning, and every motion serves a purpose. That is what separates hobby editing from professional cinematic production. Now everything depends on practice. Because understanding alone is not enough. You must rebuild, experiment, fail, adjust, and refine repeatedly until timing becomes instinct instead of calculation. And once you reach that stage, you are no longer thinking about editing technically. You are thinking in rhythm, motion, and emotion automatically. Now that we have already established the fundamental structure of cinematic beat editing inside After Effects and Premiere Pro, we need to go deeper into something that most tutorials never properly explain. Because at this stage, knowing what keyframes are, knowing what Graph Editor does, or knowing how to use time remapping is not enough to produce professional work. The real difference begins when you start understanding how all of these systems interact with each other as a single unified motion structure rather than separate tools. In professional editing environments, nothing exists in isolation. Scale animation is never just scale. Position movement is never just movement. Time remapping is never just speed control. Every single adjustment is part of a larger emotional system that controls how the viewer experiences time itself. And this is where we need to shift your thinking completely away from tool-based execution and into system-based design. Let's start by understanding motion continuity at a much deeper level. When beginners animate in After Effects, they tend to think in individual keyframes. One keyframe here, another keyframe there, and then they expect smooth motion to happen automatically. But in reality, professional motion is not defined by keyframes themselves, but by the relationship between keyframes across multiple properties simultaneously. For example, when a camera punch happens in a cinematic edit, it is not just a scale increase. It is a synchronized change in scale velocity, position offset, subtle rotation drift, and sometimes even microcolor exposure shift happening within the same frame window. The reason this works is because human perception does not separate visual components into independent layers. The brain processes motion as a unified event. So when multiple subtle changes happen at once, the viewer perceives it as physical impact rather than digital animation. Now let's go even deeper into timing structure, because timing is where most amateur editors completely fail without realizing it. In cinematic editing, timing is not just about hitting beats. Timing is about anticipation manipulation. Every motion event must be prepared slightly before it happens in order to simulate real-world inertia. Real objects in physical space do not react instantly. A camera does not jump from stillness to motion in 0 frames. There is always acceleration. There is always build-up. There is always a physical delay between intention and movement. So when your animation starts exactly on a beat with no pre-motion anticipation, the result feels artificial even if it is technically correct. This is why professional editors often introduce what we call pre-impact motion drift. This is a subtle movement that begins 1 to 3 frames before the actual beat hit. It is not noticeable consciously, but it prepares the viewer's perception system for incoming motion. When the actual impact happens, the brain already expects movement, which makes the impact feel stronger than it actually is. This is one of the most important psychological tricks used in high-end trailer editing and action montage production. Now let's expand this into graph editor behavior, because graph editor is not just a tool for smoothing motion. It is actually a velocity design system. When you open the graph editor and adjust curves, you are not adjusting animation, you are designing how speed behaves over time. A steep curve does not simply mean fast movement, it means acceleration concentration. A flat curve does not simply mean slow movement, it means energy distribution over time. When you understand this, you stop thinking about graph editor as a visual tool and start treating it as an emotional timing controller. For example, in a cinematic beat punch, the ideal curve structure is not symmetrical. Beginners often try to create balanced curves that look smooth on both sides, but professional motion curves are asymmetrical by design. The incoming velocity is extremely aggressive, almost vertical in curve steepness, because this creates the sensation of sudden impact. But the outgoing velocity is soft and extended, because real-world objects do not instantly return to rest state after impact. There is always residual motion. This imbalance between entry and exit is what creates perceived physical realism. Now we need to talk about something even more important, which is motion layering order. In most beginner edits, effects are applied randomly. A zoom is applied, then a shake is added, then a color flash is added, but there is no hierarchy in how these effects interact. In professional editing, every motion element has a priority level. Primary motion is always structural, meaning scale and position define the core movement. Secondary motion is supportive, meaning rotation, blur, and distortion enhance perception. Tertiary motion is atmospheric, meaning color shifts, light flickers, and micro effects exist only to reinforce emotion. If these layers are not structured correctly, the final output feels chaotic instead of cinematic. Now let's move into time remapping again, but from a more advanced perspective. Most tutorials explain time remapping as a way to speed up or slow down footage, but in professional workflow, time remapping is actually used as a tension compression system. When you slow down footage before a beat, you are not simply changing speed. You are compressing emotional expectation into a shorter window of time. This increases psychological pressure on the viewer. Then when the beat hits and speed suddenly increases or freezes, that compressed tension is released instantly, creating a strong emotional spike. This is why cinematic trailers often feel powerful even when the actual visual content is simple. It is not complexity that creates impact, it is controlled tension release cycles. Now let's talk about frame interpolation again, but deeper. Pixel motion is often misunderstood as just a tool for smoothing slow motion. But in reality, pixel motion is reconstructing missing temporal data between frames. This means it is not just filling gaps, it is predicting motion trajectories based on pixel displacement. When used correctly, it allows editors to extend motion events beyond their original recorded structure, effectively creating synthetic motion continuity. This is extremely powerful in cinematic editing because it allows you to slow down impact moments without losing clarity. However, overusing pixel motion can create unnatural warping artifacts, especially in high-motion scenes. This is why professionals only apply it selectively, not globally. They understand that realism is more important than smoothness. Now let's transition into a deeper concept that almost no beginner understands, which is visual rhythm independence from audio rhythm. Most beginners assume that editing means syncing everything perfectly to music. But in professional cinematic editing, perfect sync is not always desirable. Sometimes visuals intentionally drift slightly off beat to create tension. When visuals lag behind audio slightly, it creates a dragging sensation that feels heavy and cinematic. When visuals lead slightly ahead of audio, it creates urgency and anticipation. This controlled desynchronization is a high-level technique used in film trailers and emotional montage sequences. At this point, you should start to realize something very important. Cinematic editing is not about following rules. It is about understanding systems well enough to break them intentionally. Every rule we have discussed exists to train control, not to restrict creativity. Once control is mastered, intentional deviation becomes a stylistic choice rather than a mistake. Now we begin expanding into real production thinking inside After Effects. In professional environments, editors rarely work on a single composition. Instead, they build layered pre-compositions where each motion system is isolated and then combined later. For example, scale animation might exist in one pre-comp, position shake in another, and color effects in a separate adjustment layer. This allows precise control over each motion system without interfering with others. Beginners often ignore this structure and build everything in one comp, which leads to uncontrollable keyframe chaos later in the project. Another critical concept is motion decay. In physical reality, motion never stops instantly. It always decays gradually. But in beginner edits, motion often stops immediately at keyframes. This is why animations feel robotic. Professional editors always introduce decay curves, meaning motion continues slightly beyond its expected stopping point and then gradually settles. This small detail significantly increases realism. Now let's move deeper into Premiere Pro mindset, but still continuing the same system thinking. In professional editing, cutting is not just transition between clips. Cutting is emotional punctuation. Every cut represents a decision about attention direction. A cut can either reset attention, continue attention, or redirect attention. When you understand this, you stop cutting randomly and start designing attention flow across the timeline. For example, a cut during motion continuation creates flow continuity. A cut during motion interruption creates shock. A cut during stillness creates emphasis. These three cut types are the foundation of all cinematic rhythm structures. Now we expand into pacing architecture again, but deeper. Pacing is not just fast or slow. Pacing is distribution of cognitive load across time. If too much information is presented in a short period, cognitive overload occurs and attention drops. If too little information is presented over long periods, attention decays naturally. So professional pacing always alternates between high load and low load segments in controlled cycles. At this point, we are no longer talking about editing software. We are talking about human perception engineering. And once you reach this understanding, everything you do inside After Effects and Premiere Pro becomes intentional rather than mechanical. Now we continue deeper into the professional workflow, and at this stage we need to shift from theoretical motion understanding into real production execution thinking inside Premiere Pro and After Effects combined as a unified pipeline. Because in real industry environments, nobody works in isolation with only one software. Cinematic editing is always a hybrid system where structure, motion, and finishing are distributed across different stages of production. And if you do not understand how to move between these stages correctly, your workflow will always feel unstable no matter how good your individual skills are. So let's start with something extremely important that most beginners completely misunderstand, which is the role of Premiere Pro in cinematic editing pipelines. Premiere Pro is not just a cutting tool. It is not just a timeline where you place clips. In professional workflows, Premiere Pro is actually the structural foundation layer of the entire edit. It defines rhythm, pacing, and narrative direction before any motion graphics or visual effects are added. This means that before you even touch After Effects, your entire emotional structure of the video should already exist inside Premiere Pro as a rough but intentional timeline. When professionals start an edit, they do not begin with effects or animation. They begin with rhythm mapping. This means they listen to the music first and build a skeleton timeline based only on cut points. These cut points are not random. They are chosen based on energy shifts inside the music. A strong kick drum might define a major structural cut. A snare pattern might define secondary transitions. And quieter sections might define breathing space inside the timeline. This creates a rhythmic skeleton that everything else will later attach to. Now let's go deeper into cutting logic. Most beginners cut based on visual preference, meaning they cut when something looks interesting. But professional editors cut based on attention direction. This means every cut must either continue, redirect, or reset viewer focus. If a cut does not serve one of these three functions, it is unnecessary and actually weakens the edit. Continuity cuts are used when motion flows naturally from one shot to another. Directional cuts are used when movement guides the viewer's eye across the screen. And reset cuts are used when a new emotional or visual idea is introduced. Without this structure, editing becomes visually chaotic even if it looks dynamic. Now we move into advanced pacing control inside Premiere Pro, and this is where cinematic structure becomes much more sophisticated. Pacing is not simply fast or slow. Pacing is controlled fluctuation of cognitive intensity. In professional editing, you never maintain a constant level of intensity for too long because the human brain naturally adapts and stops reacting. Instead, you build waves of intensity. A slow build-up phase allows the viewer to settle. Then a gradual acceleration phase increases engagement. Then a peak intensity phase delivers maximum impact. And finally, a release phase allows emotional recovery. This cycle repeats throughout the entire edit, and mastering this structure is what makes cinematic videos feel engaging from start to finish. Now let's talk about a very important technique called temporal spacing control. This refers to how far apart your cuts are in time. Beginners often either cut too frequently or too slowly without awareness. But professionals adjust cut spacing dynamically based on emotional density. When emotional intensity is high, cuts become closer together to match cognitive load. When emotional intensity is low, cuts are spaced further apart to allow breathing room. This balance is what creates professional rhythm consistency. Now we move into one of the most powerful tools in Premiere Pro for cinematic editing, which is audio waveform-driven cutting. When you zoom into your audio timeline, you will see waveform peaks that represent energy spikes in sound. Professional editors do not guess timing. They align cuts precisely to these waveform spikes. But more importantly, they do not only cut invisible peaks. They also understand micro-energy changes inside waveform density. This allows them to create cuts that feel musically aligned even when they are not exactly on major beats. This subtle alignment is what separates mechanical editing from musical editing. Now we need to go deeper into J cuts and L cuts from a more advanced perspective. Beginners understand these as audio transition techniques, but professionals use them as emotional continuity tools. A J cut is not just audio starting early. It is emotional anticipation injection. It prepares the viewer for incoming visual change before it happens. An L cut is not just audio continuation. It is emotional echo extension, allowing the previous scene to resonate after the visual has changed. When used correctly, these techniques remove the feeling of abrupt transitions completely and replace them with emotional flow continuity. Now let's expand into match cutting at a higher level. Most people think match cuts are only about visual similarity, but in professional editing, match cuts are actually about conceptual continuity. This means two completely different shots can be connected not because they look similar, but because they represent the same motion idea or emotional direction. For example, a character falling and then cutting to a camera tilt upward can represent the same directional energy even though the visuals are unrelated. This is how cinematic storytelling creates invisible narrative links between shots. Now we go into cutting on action with more precision. Cutting on action is not just about cutting during movement. It is about cutting at the moment of maximum motion velocity change. This means the cut does not happen randomly during motion, but exactly at the point where movement shifts direction or intensity. This creates a seamless illusion of continuous motion across different shots. When executed correctly, the viewer does not perceive a cut at all, only continuous action flow. Now we must address jump cuts again, but from a professional usage perspective. Beginners often misuse jump cuts as filler or mistake corrections. But professionals use jump cuts as intentional rhythm disruption tools. A jump cut breaks continuity on purpose to create tension or urgency. In cinematic beat editing, jump cuts are often used during high-energy sections where rhythmic fragmentation enhances intensity. However, jump cuts must always align with audio structure. If they are not rhythmically aligned, they feel random and amateur. Now we move into something extremely important, which is cross-software workflow synchronization between Premiere Pro and After Effects. In professional pipelines, editors constantly move between structural editing and motion enhancement. Premiere Pro is used to define timing and structure first. Then After Effects is used to enhance specific moments with motion graphics, animation, or visual effects. Then the project is brought back into Premiere Pro for final assembly, color correction, and sound design refinement. This back-and-forth workflow is not optional in professional environments. It is essential for maintaining control over complexity. Now let's talk about why this separation is important. If you try to do everything inside After Effects, your timeline becomes too heavy, too complex, and too difficult to manage for long sequences. If you try to do everything inside Premiere Pro without motion enhancement, your edit will feel flat and lacking visual depth. So the hybrid workflow exists to balance performance, control, and visual quality. Premiere Pro handles structure, After Effects handles motion, and Premiere Pro again handles finishing. Now we move into finishing systems, which is where most beginner edits completely fall apart. Finishing is not just exporting the video. Finishing is the final layer of control over perception. This includes color consistency, audio balancing, motion smoothing, and final timing adjustments. In professional environments, the final stage of editing often takes as long as the entire assembly stage because this is where subtle refinements are made that drastically improve perceived quality. Color correction at this stage is not about artistic grading. It is about visual coherence. Every shot must feel like it belongs in the same visual universe. If one clip is slightly brighter or more saturated than another, the entire cinematic illusion breaks. This is why professionals constantly match exposure, contrast, and tone across all clips before final export. Audio balancing is equally important. Music, impacts, ambient sound, and transitions must all exist in a controlled hierarchy. If everything is equally loud, nothing feels impactful. Professionals always design audio layers so that certain moments dominate while others support quietly in the background. Finally, export settings are not just technical output decisions. They are preservation decisions. The goal of export is to preserve as much perceived quality as possible while maintaining platform compatibility. Incorrect export settings can destroy even the most perfect edit by introducing compression artifacts, frame blending issues, or motion degradation. At this point, you should start to see the full picture of cinematic editing as a complete system rather than a collection of tools. It is a layered structure where rhythm defines structure, structure defines motion placement, motion defines emotional impact, and all of these elements combine to control viewer attention across time. And once you understand this system deeply, you are no longer just editing videos. You are designing controlled emotional experiences that unfold frame by frame. Now we continue by moving away from isolated technique explanation and into full real-world editing execution, because at a professional level, understanding individual tools is meaningless unless you understand how an entire project is constructed from beginning to end under real production constraints. In actual cinematic editing workflows, especially in trailer work, gaming edits, or commercial content, you are never building effects first. You are always building structure first, then layering emotion, then refining motion, and finally polishing perception. This sequence is non-negotiable in professional environments because it ensures stability throughout the entire project. So let's imagine we are now building a complete cinematic beat edit from scratch. The first stage is always what professionals call structural mapping. At this stage, you do not think about visuals at all. You only think about rhythm and energy flow. You take your music track and you analyze it not as a listener, but as a timing blueprint. Every kick, every snare, every bass drop, every silence, every transition in the music becomes a structural decision point. These points are not just markers. They are emotional anchors that define the entire visual architecture of your edit. Once these anchor points are defined, the next step is to build what is called a temporal skeleton. This means placing empty placeholders on your timeline that represent where major visual events will occur. At this stage, you are not even choosing footage yet. You are simply defining where energy changes will happen. This is extremely important because beginners usually skip this step and immediately start placing clips, which leads to chaotic pacing and inconsistent energy distribution. Professionals never build visually first. They build rhythm first. Now we move into footage selection logic, which is another area where amateurs and professionals differ significantly. Beginners choose clips based on how cool they look individually. Professionals choose clips based on how well they fit into timing structure. A visually impressive clip that does not match timing structure is useless in cinematic editing. Every clip must serve a rhythmic purpose. It must either enhance impact moments, support transitions, or maintain continuity between beats. If a clip does not serve one of these functions, it does not belong in the edit. Now we enter assembly phase inside Premiere Pro. At this stage, you begin placing clips according to your temporal skeleton. But again, this is not about perfect editing. This is about structural alignment. You are matching visual events to previously defined energy points. And this is where pacing discipline becomes critical. Because if you place too many high-energy clips in sequence, the viewer becomes desensitized. If you place too many low-energy clips in sequence, attention drops. So professional editors constantly alternate energy levels to maintain cognitive engagement. Now let's talk about something extremely important in Hollywood trailer structure, which is energy escalation curve design. Every professional trailer follows a hidden structure that is not obvious to casual viewers. It begins with establishment, then moves into tension building, then into escalation, then into peak intensity, and finally into resolution or release. This structure exists because human attention naturally responds to rising and falling intensity waves. If you maintain constant intensity, the brain adapts and loses emotional response. So cinematic editing is always about controlled escalation, not constant excitement. Now we go deeper into escalation mechanics. Escalation is not just faster cuts or louder music. Escalation is layered compression of attention cycles. At the beginning, attention cycles are long and stable. As intensity increases, attention cycles become shorter and more reactive. This means cuts become more frequent, motion becomes more aggressive, and audio beat alignment becomes tighter. But the key is that escalation must feel progressive, not sudden. If escalation happens too quickly, the viewer loses emotional investment. If it happens too slowly, engagement drops. So professional editors carefully design acceleration curves over time, not just within individual clips. Now we transition into After Effects enhancement stage, where specific moments from the Premiere Pro structure are selected for motion amplification. At this stage, you are not animating everything. You are selecting key emotional peaks and enhancing only those points. This is extremely important because over-animation destroys focus. Cinematic editing is not about constant motion. It is about selective emphasis. Only important moments should be visually amplified. Everything else should remain stable to create contrast. When you bring a clip into After Effects for enhancement, the first decision is always motion hierarchy. You decide what the primary motion is, what the secondary motion is, and what the supporting motion is. For example, a scale punch might be primary motion. A slight position shake might be secondary motion. And a subtle blur or light flicker might be supporting motion. These layers must never compete with each other. They must work together to create a single unified impact moment. Now we need to talk about one of the most important Hollywood editing principles, which is impact compression and release. Every cinematic hit is built using a three-stage structure. First is anticipation, where motion subtly builds before the event. Second is impact, where maximum energy is released in a very short time frame. And third is decay, where motion settles and returns to baseline. If any of these three stages are missing, the impact feels incomplete. Beginners often only focus on the impact stage and ignore anticipation and decay, which is why their edits feel flat even when effects are strong. Now let's go deeper into real-world failure analysis, because understanding why edits fail is just as important as understanding how to build them. One of the most common failure patterns in beginner cinematic edits is oversyncing. This happens when every single visual event is perfectly aligned to audio beats without variation. While this may sound correct, it actually removes emotional dynamics. Real cinematic energy requires variation in timing alignment. Some impacts should land exactly on beats. Some should slightly lead. Some should slightly lag. This variation creates unpredictability, which keeps viewer attention engaged. Another major failure pattern is motion saturation. This occurs when too many layers of motion are active simultaneously. When scale, position, rotation, blur, color flash, and shake are all active at full intensity at the same time, the brain cannot prioritize visual information, and the result becomes noisy instead of cinematic. Professional editors avoid this by controlling motion density. They intentionally leave space between motion events so that each impact has clarity and weight. Now we move into what we call cinematic perception control, which is the highest level of editing understanding. At this stage, you are no longer thinking about software or tools. You are thinking about how the viewer experiences time. You are essentially controlling attention like a physical object. You decide when attention accelerates, when it slows down, when it breaks, and when it resets. This is why professional editing feels so immersive. It is not because of effects, but because of precise attention engineering. Now let's discuss one of the most important hidden rules in Hollywood trailer editing, which is contrast dependency. Cinematic impact does not come from intensity alone. It comes from contrast between low energy and high energy states. If everything is intense, nothing feels intense. If everything is calm, nothing feels engaging. So professional editors constantly alternate between compression phases and release phases. This contrast is what creates emotional depth in the edit. Now we transition into final refinement thinking. At this stage of editing, professionals are no longer making large changes. They are making micro adjustments that dramatically affect perception. This includes shifting keyframes by 1 or 2 frames, slightly adjusting easing curves, modifying cut timing by fractions of a second, and balancing audio peaks so that no single element overwhelms the others. These micro adjustments are often invisible individually, but collectively they define the difference between amateur and professional output. Finally, we reach the concept of edit identity. At the highest level of cinematic editing, every editor develops a signature style not through effects, but through timing behavior. Some editors prefer tight, aggressive pacing. Some prefer smooth cinematic flow. Some prefer chaotic rhythmic fragmentation. But in all cases, style is defined by how time is controlled, not by what effects are used. Effects are just tools. Timing is identity. And once you understand this, you realize that cinematic editing is not about learning software anymore. It is about mastering perception itself. Now we continue by moving away from isolated technique explanation and into full real-world editing execution, because at a professional level, understanding individual tools is meaningless unless you understand how an entire project is constructed from beginning to end under real production constraints. In actual cinematic editing workflows, especially in trailer work, gaming edits, or commercial content, you are never building effects first. You are always building structure first, then layering emotion, then refining motion, and finally polishing perception. This sequence is non-negotiable in professional environments because it ensures stability throughout the entire project. So let's imagine we are now building a complete cinematic beat edit from scratch. The first stage is always what professionals call structural mapping. At this stage, you do not think about visuals at all. You only think about rhythm and energy flow. You take your music track and you analyze it not as a listener, but as a timing blueprint. Every kick, every snare, every bass drop, every silence, every transition in the music becomes a structural decision point. These points are not just markers. They are emotional anchors that define the entire visual architecture of your edit. Once these anchor points are defined, the next step is to build what is called a temporal skeleton. This means placing empty placeholders on your timeline that represent where major visual events will occur. At this stage, you are not even choosing footage yet. You are simply defining where energy changes will happen. This is extremely important because beginners usually skip this step and immediately start placing clips, which leads to chaotic pacing and inconsistent energy distribution. Professionals never build visually first. They build rhythm first. Now we move into footage selection logic, which is another area where amateurs and professionals differ significantly. Beginners choose clips based on how cool they look individually. Professionals choose clips based on how well they fit into timing structure. A visually impressive clip that does not match timing structure is useless in cinematic editing. Every clip must serve a rhythmic purpose. It must either enhance impact moments, support transitions, or maintain continuity between beats. If a clip does not serve one of these functions, it does not belong in the edit. Now we enter assembly phase inside Premiere Pro. At this stage, you begin placing clips according to your temporal skeleton. But again, this is not about perfect editing. This is about structural alignment. You are matching visual events to previously defined energy points. And this is where pacing discipline becomes critical. Because if you place too many high-energy clips in sequence, the viewer becomes desensitized. If you place too many low-energy clips in sequence, attention drops. So professional editors constantly alternate energy levels to maintain cognitive engagement. Now let's talk about something extremely important in Hollywood trailer structure, which is energy escalation curve design. Every professional trailer follows a hidden structure that is not obvious to casual viewers. It begins with establishment, then moves into tension building, then into escalation, then into peak intensity, and finally into resolution or release. This structure exists because human attention naturally responds to rising and falling intensity waves. If you maintain constant intensity, the brain adapts and loses emotional response. So cinematic editing is always about controlled escalation, not constant excitement. Now we go deeper into escalation mechanics. Escalation is not just faster cuts or louder music. Escalation is layered compression of attention cycles. At the beginning, attention cycles are long and stable. As intensity increases, attention cycles become shorter and more reactive. This means cuts become more frequent, motion becomes more aggressive, and audio beat alignment becomes tighter. But the key is that escalation must feel progressive, not sudden. If escalation happens too quickly, the viewer loses emotional investment. If it happens too slowly, engagement drops. So professional editors carefully design acceleration curves over time, not just within individual clips. Now we transition into After Effects enhancement stage, where specific moments from the Premiere Pro structure are selected for motion amplification. At this stage, you are not animating everything. You are selecting key emotional peaks and enhancing only those points. This is extremely important because over-animation destroys focus. Cinematic editing is not about constant motion. It is about selective emphasis. Only important moments should be visually amplified. Everything else should remain stable to create contrast. When you bring a clip into After Effects for enhancement, the first decision is always motion hierarchy. You decide what the primary motion is, what the secondary motion is, and what the supporting motion is. For example, a scale punch might be primary motion. A slight position shake might be secondary motion. And a subtle blur or light flicker might be supporting motion. These layers must never compete with each other. They must work together to create a single unified impact moment. Now we need to talk about one of the most important Hollywood editing principles, which is impact compression and release. Every cinematic hit is built using a three-stage structure. First is anticipation, where motion subtly builds before the event. Second is impact, where maximum energy is released in a very short time frame. And third is decay, where motion settles and returns to baseline. If any of these three stages are missing, the impact feels incomplete. Beginners often only focus on the impact stage and ignore anticipation and decay, which is why their edits feel flat even when effects are strong. Now let's go deeper into real-world failure analysis, because understanding why edits fail is just as important as understanding how to build them. One of the most common failure patterns in beginner cinematic edits is oversyncing. This happens when every single visual event is perfectly aligned to audio beats without variation. While this may sound correct, it actually removes emotional dynamics. Real cinematic energy requires variation in timing alignment. Some impacts should land exactly on beats. Some should slightly lead. Some should slightly lag. This variation creates unpredictability, which keeps viewer attention engaged. Another major failure pattern is motion saturation. This occurs when too many layers of motion are active simultaneously. When scale, position, rotation, blur, color flash, and shake are all active at full intensity at the same time, the brain cannot prioritize visual information, and the result becomes noisy instead of cinematic. Professional editors avoid this by controlling motion density. They intentionally leave space between motion events so that each impact has clarity and weight. Now we move into what we call cinematic perception control, which is the highest level of editing understanding. At this stage, you are no longer thinking about software or tools. You are thinking about how the viewer experiences time. You are essentially controlling attention like a physical object. You decide when attention accelerates, when it slows down, when it breaks, and when it resets. This is why professional editing feels so immersive. It is not because of effects, but because of precise attention engineering. Now let's discuss one of the most important hidden rules in Hollywood trailer editing, which is contrast dependency. Cinematic impact does not come from intensity alone. It comes from contrast between low energy and high energy states. If everything is intense, nothing feels intense. If everything is calm, nothing feels engaging. So professional editors constantly alternate between compression phases and release phases. This contrast is what creates emotional depth in the edit. Now we transition into final refinement thinking. At this stage of editing, professionals are no longer making large changes. They are making micro adjustments that dramatically affect perception. This includes shifting keyframes by 1 or 2 frames, slightly adjusting easing curves, modifying cut timing by fractions of a second, and balancing audio peaks so that no single element overwhelms the others. These micro adjustments are often invisible individually, but collectively they define the difference between amateur and professional output. Finally, we reach the concept of edit identity. At the highest level of cinematic editing, every editor develops a signature style not through effects, but through timing behavior. Some editors prefer tight, aggressive pacing. Some prefer smooth cinematic flow. Some prefer chaotic rhythmic fragmentation. But in all cases, style is defined by how time is controlled, not by what effects are used. Effects are just tools. Timing is identity. And once you understand this, you realize that cinematic editing is not about learning software anymore. It is about mastering perception itself. Now we continue into one of the most practical and valuable layers of cinematic editing, which is understanding how viral short-form content is actually structured at a timing level, because once you move from cinematic theory into real platform performance, everything changes. On platforms like TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Instagram Reels, success is not determined by how complex your editing is, but by how quickly your video establishes attention, how efficiently it sustains engagement, and how precisely it delivers emotional payoff within extremely compressed time windows. So let's break down what actually happens in the first few seconds of a high-performing edit. The first second is not about storytelling. It is not about context. It is not even about visual beauty. The first second is purely about attention capture. This means your visual system must immediately create a pattern interruption. A pattern interruption is anything that breaks the viewer's expectation of what they were about to see. This could be an instant motion burst, a sudden zoom, a high-contrast visual shift, or a rhythmic audio spike aligned with a visual impact. If the viewer's brain does not detect novelty within the first second, they will scroll away without processing anything else. Now, once attention is captured, the second phase begins, which is attention stabilization. This is where most beginner editors fail without realizing it. They capture attention successfully, but they do not stabilize it. Stabilization means the viewer now understands what kind of visual experience they are watching and decides to stay. This does not require complexity. In fact, too much complexity at this stage often causes drop-off. Stabilization is achieved through rhythm consistency. This means establishing a predictable beat alignment pattern so the viewer's brain can sync with the edit. Once synchronization happens, the viewer stops feeling like they are watching a video and starts feeling like they are inside a rhythm system. After stabilization comes escalation, which we have already discussed at a structural level, but now we need to understand it from a micro-timing perspective. Escalation in short-form content is not linear. It is exponential. This means energy does not increase gradually at a constant rate. Instead, it increases in waves. Each wave is slightly more intense than the previous one, but the spacing between waves becomes shorter. This creates a sensation of acceleration over time, even if the actual visual complexity remains controlled. This is one of the key reasons why viral edits feel like they are building up even when nothing visually dramatic is happening. Now we move into payoff structure, which is the most important part of any viral edit. Payoff is the moment where all accumulated tension is released. But in high-performing content, payoff is never a single moment. It is a cluster of micro payoffs layered together. For example, a scale punch might be followed by a micro shake, then a color flash, then a speed ramp release, then a final cut. Each of these elements alone is small, but together they create a compound emotional release. This is what gives viral edits their addictive feeling. Now let's connect this to After Effects execution, because theory alone is not enough. When building viral-style cinematic beats inside After Effects, you must think in terms of motion packets instead of individual animations. A motion packet is a self-contained unit of energy that includes anticipation, impact, and decay. Every time you create a beat moment, you are not creating one animation, you are creating a full packet of motion behavior that exists over time. If you only create impact without anticipation or decay, the motion packet feels incomplete and the viewer subconsciously registers it as unnatural. Now we go deeper into automated motion systems, which is where professional editors separate themselves from manual beginners. In real production environments, editors do not manually keyframe every single motion event. Instead, they build reusable motion systems using expressions and linked parameters. For example, instead of manually creating shake on every beat, professionals use audio amplitude data linked to position and scale values so that motion responds dynamically to sound input. This means the edit becomes partially self-driving, reacting to audio energy instead of relying on manual timing. This approach becomes extremely powerful when working with long edits because it reduces cognitive load and allows the editor to focus on structural decisions instead of repetitive animation work. At a higher level, this is what allows professional studios to produce large volumes of cinematic content without sacrificing quality consistency. Now let's move into something even more important, which is visual hierarchy control inside fast-paced edits. When multiple visual elements are moving at the same time, the brain naturally tries to prioritize one element as the focal point. If you do not control this hierarchy deliberately, the viewer will randomly choose where to look, which reduces narrative control. Professional editors solve this by controlling motion intensity distribution. This means only one element is allowed to be in peak motion state at any given moment. Everything else must remain supportive or neutral. This ensures that attention is always guided, never scattered. Now we transition into advanced Premiere Pro execution logic again, but at a higher structural level. In professional workflows, Premiere Pro is not just used for cutting, but for attention path design. This means you are not just arranging clips in sequence, you are designing where the viewer looks at every moment in time. Every cut, every transition, every pause is a directional decision. You are essentially building a guided attention map across the entire timeline. One of the most powerful tools for this is intentional rhythm breaking. While most editors focus on perfect beat alignment, professionals deliberately introduce controlled irregularities. For example, instead of cutting exactly on every beat, they may delay a cut by 1 or 2 frames, or advance it slightly ahead of the beat. This creates subconscious tension because the brain expects predictability but receives variation. This variation increases engagement because it prevents neural adaptation. Now we talk about something that is rarely discussed in tutorials, which is fatigue management in cinematic edits. Every viewer has a limited attention capacity, and if you overload it continuously without relief, engagement drops regardless of visual quality. This is why professional edits always include micro rest points. These are very short moments where motion density decreases, cuts slow down slightly, or visual intensity is reduced. These moments are not boring sections. They are recovery intervals that allow the viewer to reset their cognitive processing ability before the next wave of intensity. Now let's move into commercial level thinking. When you are editing for real clients or monetized content, your goal is not just to create something visually impressive, but to maintain retention curves. Retention curves measure how long viewers stay engaged across time. In high-performing edits, retention is not linear. It fluctuates based on stimulus cycles. Every spike in intensity increases attention, but if spikes are too frequent or too predictable, retention drops due to saturation. So professional editors design retention curves like controlled energy graphs, balancing spikes and recovery phases. Now we reach the concept of perceived production value, which is one of the most misunderstood ideas in editing. Many beginners assume that higher production value comes from more effects, more plugins, or more complex animations. In reality, perceived production value comes from consistency, control, and timing precision. A simple edit with perfect timing will always feel more professional than a complex edit with inconsistent rhythm. This is because the human brain associates precision with quality more strongly than complexity. Finally, we connect everything back into a unified workflow philosophy. Cinematic editing is not a collection of techniques. It is a layered system of attention control, timing manipulation, and emotional engineering. Every decision you make inside After Effects or Premiere Pro is ultimately serving one goal, which is guiding how the viewer experiences time. Once you fully understand this, your editing stops being mechanical execution and becomes intentional design. And at this point, the difference between beginner and professional is no longer technical knowledge. It is perception. It is the ability to see time as something editable, shapeable, and controllable rather than something fixed. Now we move into the final stage of understanding cinematic editing, which is not about individual techniques anymore, but about complete production workflow integration, because at a professional level, no one evaluates an editor based on isolated skills. What matters is whether you can consistently deliver a finished product that feels cohesive, intentional, and structurally complete from beginning to end. And this requires understanding how all the systems we discussed earlier interact inside a full production pipeline. So let's reconstruct the entire process from start to finish as it happens in real professional environments. The first phase is always conceptual design. At this stage, you are not editing, and you are not even selecting footage. You are defining the emotional objective of the project. Every cinematic edit must have a core emotional direction. It could be intensity, tension, aggression, nostalgia, inspiration, or release. Without defining this emotional direction first, your editing decisions will always feel inconsistent because you have no reference point for whether a motion or cut is appropriate. Once the emotional objective is defined, the second phase is structural planning. This is where you break the entire video into segments based on energy levels. You are essentially designing an emotional map of the video before any visual work begins. This includes identifying where build-up starts, where escalation begins, where peak intensity happens, and where release or resolution occurs. This emotional map is not optional in professional workflows. It is what prevents chaotic pacing and ensures that every editing decision contributes to a larger structure. Now we enter the third phase, which is asset alignment. At this stage, you gather all footage, audio, and visual elements, but you do not edit yet. Instead, you evaluate how each asset can serve different sections of your emotional map. This is where professional editors differ significantly from beginners. Beginners force footage into a timeline. Professionals assign footage roles within a structure. Every clip must have a purpose, either establishing context, building rhythm, delivering impact, or supporting transitions. If a clip does not serve a structural role, it is removed regardless of how visually appealing it is. Now we move into the fourth phase, which is rough assembly inside Premiere Pro. This is where the actual timeline begins to take shape, but still without detailed refinement. At this stage, speed and structure are more important than precision. You are not focusing on perfect cuts or transitions. You are focusing on whether the emotional map is working in practice. You place clips according to your energy structure, align them loosely to audio beats, and ensure that the overall flow matches your intended escalation curve. This stage is about validation, not perfection. Once rough assembly is complete, we enter the fifth phase, which is rhythm locking. This is one of the most important stages in professional editing. Rhythm locking means synchronizing all major visual events to your chosen audio structure with precise timing control. But unlike beginner beat syncing, rhythm locking is not about matching every beat. It is about choosing which beats matter. In professional edits, only key beats are emphasized. Secondary beats are often ignored or subtly implied rather than explicitly animated. This selective synchronization creates hierarchy in rhythm and prevents visual overload. Now we move into the sixth phase, which is motion design inside After Effects. At this stage, only selected high-impact moments are transferred into After Effects for enhancement. This is extremely important because not every frame needs motion graphics. Overuse of After Effects destroys visual focus and creates fatigue. Instead, professionals identify impact points and treat them as isolated motion events. Each event is then designed as a complete motion packet, including anticipation, impact, and decay, as discussed earlier. Inside After Effects, the focus is not on adding effects, but on refining motion behavior. This means adjusting keyframe timing, refining easing curves, balancing scale and position interaction, and ensuring that motion feels physically coherent. The graph editor becomes the central control system here because it defines how energy flows through time. At this stage, even a one-frame adjustment can significantly change emotional perception, which is why professionals constantly zoom into micro-timing levels rather than working at broad timeline scales. Now we move into the seventh phase, which is reintegration back into Premiere Pro. Once motion-enhanced segments are completed in After Effects, they are reassembled into the main timeline. At this point, the edit begins to take its final shape. But it is still not finished. Because now we enter the refinement phase, which is where professional quality is actually determined. Refinement is not about large changes. It is about micro-adjustments that affect perception without being visually obvious. This includes adjusting cut timing by 1 or 2 frames, balancing motion transitions between shots, ensuring consistent exposure across clips, and aligning audio peaks with visual emphasis points. These micro-refinements are what separate amateur-level polish from professional-level finish. Now we enter the eighth phase, which is global pacing calibration. At this stage, you evaluate the entire video as a complete experience rather than individual sections. You ask a critical question: does the energy flow feel natural when viewed continuously from start to finish? If there are sections where attention drops too sharply or spikes too frequently, you adjust pacing distribution. This may involve shortening certain segments, extending others, or redistributing motion intensity across the timeline. Now we move into the ninth phase, which is audio hierarchy design. In professional cinematic editing, audio is not just background support. It is a structural component of emotional control. Music defines rhythm, but sound effects define impact clarity. Whooshes, hits, risers, and bass drops all serve to reinforce visual motion. If audio hierarchy is poorly designed, even visually perfect edits feel weak. So professionals always balance audio layers so that important moments dominate while supporting layers remain subtle and non-intrusive. Now we reach the 10th phase, which is color in visual consistency alignment. At this stage, color is not used for artistic expression. It is used for coherence control. Every clip must feel like it belongs in the same visual environment. If one shot has slightly different contrast, temperature, or saturation, it breaks immersion. So professionals adjust color minimally but consistently across the entire sequence. The goal is not stylization at this stage, but unity. Finally, we enter the 11th and final phase, which is export and perception preservation. Export settings are not just technical output choices. They are the final preservation layer of your entire edit. Incorrect export settings can destroy motion smoothness, introduce compression artifacts, or flatten dynamic range. Professional editors always ensure that frame integrity, motion clarity, and audio synchronization are preserved during export. Now that we have reconstructed the full pipeline, it becomes clear that cinematic editing is not a collection of isolated skills. It is a structured production system where each phase builds upon the previous one. If any phase is missing or poorly executed, the entire output suffers regardless of how strong individual effects or techniques are. And at the highest level, professional editors are not defined by their ability to use software. They are defined by their ability to control complexity across time. Because editing is ultimately not about visuals or effects. It is about designing how a viewer experiences time, attention, and emotion from the first frame to the last. Once you fully understand this system, you stop thinking like someone who is learning tools, and you start thinking like someone who is designing experiences. Now we reach the final layer of understanding cinematic editing, and at this point, everything we have discussed so far needs to be unified into a single coherent mindset shift, because if you still see After Effects, Premiere Pro, keyframes, graph editors, or cutting techniques as separate skills, then you are still thinking like a technician instead of a creator who understands systems. And in professional environments, the difference between a technician and a cinematic editor is not tool mastery, but control over perception across time. So let's consolidate everything into its most fundamental truth. Cinematic editing is not about making things look good. It is about controlling how attention behaves over time. Every technique we have discussed, whether it is scale punching, time remapping, motion layering, cutting rhythm, audio syncing, or pacing structure, is ultimately just a method of influencing attention trajectory. That means your real job as an editor is not to animate, not to cut, and not to apply effects, but to design the path that human attention follows from the first frame to the last frame. Once you understand this, every decision you make inside editing software changes fundamentally. For example, a keyframe is no longer just a point in time where values change. It becomes a decision point in attention flow. A cut is no longer just a transition between clips. It becomes a redirection of perception. A zoom is no longer just scale animation. It becomes a focus compression mechanism that forces the viewer's attention into a specific visual region. This shift in thinking is what separates mechanical editing from cinematic editing. Now let's go deeper into what professional editors actually optimize for, because it is not complexity, and it is not even beauty in isolation. The true optimization target in cinematic editing is perceived intentionality. This means that every motion, every cut, and every transition must feel like it was deliberately designed for a reason. Even if the viewer does not consciously understand why a moment feels good, they must feel that nothing is random. The human brain is extremely sensitive to randomness in visual rhythm. If something feels unintentional, attention drops immediately. But if everything feels controlled, even simple visuals become engaging. This is why in professional workflows, reduction is often more powerful than addition. Beginners always try to add more effects, more transitions, more motion layers, more visual complexity. But professionals constantly remove unnecessary elements until only essential motion remains. Because clarity is what allows perception to stabilize. And once perception is stable, emotional impact becomes significantly stronger. Now let's talk about what actually creates cinematic feeling at the deepest level. It is not resolution, it is not color grading, and it is not even camera quality. Cinematic feeling comes from temporal control density. This means how precisely time is being shaped across the edit. In cinematic work, time is not linear. It is elastic. It expands during buildup, compresses during impact, and stabilizes during resolution. When you control these expansions and compressions intentionally, the viewer experiences time differently from normal perception. That distortion of time perception is what creates the cinematic feeling. Now we must address something extremely important that most editors never fully realize, which is that emotional response in editing is not created by single moments, but by contrast accumulation. A single impact means very little on its own. But when multiple impacts are arranged with increasing intensity and decreasing spacing, the brain begins to anticipate patterns. And once anticipation is established, even small changes in motion or sound become emotionally amplified. This is why structured escalation is far more powerful than random high-energy sequences. At a professional level, editing becomes a system of expectation management. You are constantly building expectations in the viewer's mind and then either fulfilling them, delaying them, or breaking them intentionally. Fulfillment creates satisfaction, delay creates tension, and breaking creates surprise. These three mechanisms are the foundation of all cinematic engagement. Every viral edit, every trailer, every high-retention video operates on variations of these three psychological triggers. Now let's bring everything back into a single unified workflow identity. If you were to describe professional cinematic editing in one sentence, it would not be about software, and it would not be about effects. It would be about constructing controlled emotional experiences through time-based perception design. That is the full definition. Everything else is implementation detail. So when you open After Effects in the future, you should not be thinking about how to make a cool effect. You should be thinking about what moment in time requires emphasis, what level of intensity is appropriate for that moment, and how motion should evolve before and after that point to create a complete emotional packet. And when you open Premiere Pro, you should not be thinking about just cutting clips together. You should be thinking about how attention should travel across the timeline, how pacing should rise and fall, and how rhythm should guide perception without distraction. At the highest level of cinematic editing, your role is no longer an editor in the traditional sense. You become a designer of perception flow. You are shaping how time is experienced, how emotion is distributed, and how attention is controlled across a structured sequence of visual and audio events. And once you reach this level of understanding, improvement is no longer about learning new tools. It becomes about refinement of sensitivity. You begin to notice smaller timing differences, more subtle motion inconsistencies, and more precise emotional shifts inside edits. Your judgment becomes more important than your execution speed, because what separates good work from exceptional work is no longer effort, but awareness. So if there is one final idea to take from this entire masterclass, it is this. Cinematic editing is not something you perform. It is something you design. It is not about following steps. It is about controlling systems. And it is not about making videos. It is about shaping how people feel time while watching them. And once you truly understand that, you are no longer learning editing anymore.
You are using editing as a language of controlled perception.
Now we reach what can be considered the highest layer of cinematic editing understanding, and at this point, the discussion is no longer about workflows, tools, or even creative techniques in isolation. It becomes about professional identity inside the editing industry, because once you reach a certain level of technical competence, the difference between editors is no longer defined by what they can do, but by how they think when they are not actively editing. In real professional environments, the strongest editors are not the ones who constantly add complexity to their work. They are the ones who understand when not to edit. This is something that beginners rarely understand because they associate value with visible effort. But in high-end production, invisibility of effort is actually the goal. If an edit feels like it required no effort, but still feels perfectly controlled, that is considered a high-level result. Because it means the viewer is experiencing pure intention without noticing construction. At this level, editing becomes less about action and more about restraint. Every decision to add motion, every decision to cut, every decision to transition, is weighed against a single question: does this increase clarity of emotional direction, or does it introduce unnecessary noise into perception? And surprisingly often, the correct professional decision is to do nothing. To leave space. To allow motion to breathe. To allow silence in rhythm. Because silence in editing is not absence of content. It is controlled perception space that increases contrast for the next event. Now let's talk about something that separates intermediate editors from truly advanced ones, which is internal rhythm independence. Most editors rely entirely on external rhythm sources like music. But advanced editors understand that every visual sequence also has its own internal rhythm, independent of audio. This means that even if music is removed, the visual sequence should still feel rhythmically coherent. This is achieved through consistent motion logic, predictable variation patterns, and controlled pacing structures within the visuals themselves. When you reach this level, you begin to understand that audio is not the master controller of editing. It is just one layer in a multi-layered rhythm system. Visual rhythm, audio rhythm, and emotional rhythm all operate simultaneously, and professional editing is the process of aligning and occasionally misaligning these layers intentionally to create depth. Now we move into something even more abstract, which is perception-like control. Human perception does not process visual information instantly. There is a slight delay between what is seen and what is emotionally registered. Professional editors use this delay as a creative tool. For example, an impact might occur visually, but the emotional response is intentionally delayed by a few frames through motion decay or audio reinforcement timing. This creates a feeling of weight, because the brain is still processing the event after it has already happened. That lingering processing state is what creates cinematic heaviness. Now let's discuss something that is rarely ever explained in tutorials, which is attention anchoring. In every cinematic sequence, the viewer's attention must always have a stable anchor point. If attention has no anchor, it drifts. If it drifts too much, engagement collapses. Anchors can be visual, such as a central subject. They can be motion-based, such as repeated movement patterns. Or they can be audio-based, such as rhythmic beats or recurring sound cues. But regardless of form, professional editing always ensures that attention has something to attach itself to at every moment in time. Now we expand into creative decision hierarchy, which is how professionals decide what actually matters during editing. Beginners treat all elements equally, but professionals assign importance layers. Primary importance is always timing. Secondary importance is motion behavior. Tertiary importance is visual styling. And decorative elements are always last. This hierarchy ensures that even if visual effects are simplified, the edit still works because timing and motion structure remain intact.
Now we enter the concept of adaptive editing thinking.
In real production, no edit survives the first version unchanged.
Every edit evolves through iteration. Professionals constantly re-evaluate structure after initial assembly because what looks good in isolation may not work in full sequence context. This means editing is not a linear process. It is cyclical. You build, you test, you break, you adjust, and you rebuild again. Each cycle refines timing sensitivity and improves perception control. At this point, we must also address a fundamental truth about cinematic editing that is often misunderstood. Complexity is not a requirement for professionalism. Control is.
A simple sequence with perfect timing, perfect pacing, and perfect emotional alignment will always outperform a complex sequence that lacks structure.
Because viewers do not respond to complexity.
They respond to coherence.
Now let's move into the final conceptual layer, which is editing as controlled illusion of continuity. Every cinematic edit is technically a discontinuity. You are always cutting between moments that did not originally exist together.
But professional editing hides this discontinuity so effectively that the viewer perceives continuity that feels natural.
This illusion is built through motion matching, audio continuity, and timing alignment.
When these three systems are perfectly balanced, the brain stops perceiving cuts as interruptions and instead perceives them as natural progression. And once you understand this, you realize that editing is not about joining clips together. It is about constructing the illusion of uninterrupted experience through controlled fragmentation.
Now we arrive at the final realization of this entire system.
Everything we have discussed across After Effects, Premiere Pro, motion design, cutting structure, pacing theory, viral content design, and cinematic workflow all converge into one single principle. Editing is the art of shaping attention over time using layered perception control systems. That is the complete definition. And at this point, your progression as an editor is no longer dependent on learning new effects or techniques. It depends entirely on how sensitively you can perceive timing, motion, and emotional response in real time. Because professional growth is not about accumulating knowledge. It is about refining awareness. So when you move forward from this, the goal is no longer to ask what effect should I use, or what transition is best, or how do I make this look cinematic? The real question becomes what should the viewer be feeling at this exact moment in time, and how precisely do I need to shape motion, rhythm, and pacing to guide that feeling without distraction. And once you consistently think in that way, editing stops being a technical process entirely. It becomes a form of controlled perception design that operates across time, emotion, and attention simultaneously.